The conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is once again in the news. On October the 7th, the Palestinian Islamist organization Hamas launched a raid from its bases in the Gaza Strip into southern Israel, killing as many as 1,200 Israelis and abducting many more, including women and children. In response, the Israeli government of Bibi Netanyahu launched a counteroffensive into Gaza that has cost the lives of nearly 30,000 Palestinians, including, according to the United Nations, 8,000 children. The latest round of fighting has excited passions around the world. For some, Israel is engaged in a righteous, legitimate self-defense operation, while for others, the operation is nothing short of a genocidal campaign directed at liquidating the Palestinian population of Gaza. However, history did not begin on October the 7th. In this episode of Talking History, we journey back to the early 20th century to discuss the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict, a period in which the territory that comprises Israel-Palestine formed part of the Ottoman Empire. My name is Djene.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
And you're listening to Talking History.
Joining us from Jerusalem to speak with us on this topic is Dr. Louis Fishman. Dr. Fishman is an associate professor at Brooklyn College, University of New York, and writes on Turkish and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He has lived most of his life between the U.S., Israel, and Turkey. He is a regular contributor at the Israeli newspaper Haaretz and is an author of Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Era, 1908 to 1914, Claiming Homeland, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2021. Dr. Fishman, welcome to Talking History.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late in Jerusalem. So I wanted to talk to you today about the historical context of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Obviously, as I mentioned at the top, there's a lot of strong feelings about this conflict. It has a lot of political implications for us today, both in Israel-Palestine, but around the world. But I think it's very important for us to kind of have a historical perspective on these things. And your book, Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Era, examines a period which you say set the stage for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I find this a very interesting way of looking at things, because obviously people who discuss this issue, people who talk about this issue, will locate the origins of this conflict in different historical eras. Some look back to the foundation of the State of Israel in the 1940s. Others will project back this conflict, thousands of years, all the way back to the Roman era and so on. So I want to ask you to begin with, why do you locate the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in this specific era, in this late Ottoman period, and specifically this period between 1908 and 1914?
First of all, it's a great question. Let me go ahead and start by saying that, when I teach this, when I teach the class, Palestinian Israeli history, I usually start off stressing that this is a modern conflict, most definitely. And it really, if you go back and without getting into much of Ottoman history, it really goes back to, we can look at the Tanzimat reforms that lead us to issues of renewed relations or different types of relations between the Muslim population in the Ottoman Empire, which was mostly Turkish, and some Kurdish, of course, and Arab, right, up until 1914. And we see relations between them and the non-Muslim communities. So we can really trace back the idea of modernity, that this conflict has emerged, and it is a modern conflict of you could even argue of on one hand clashing identities, but on the other hand, not a surprising one. Since finishing my book a couple years ago, I'm doing new work, and I'm really seeing that this age of nationalism where suddenly everyone wants to belong to a group that they identify with as their group. So they see themselves as one and the same, right? They see themselves as the national group that is forming, and they want to be represented as that national group. So up until up until the 1850s, and even we could arguably late 1880s, 1890s, that was something completely novel in the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire, of course, is not cut off from the rest of the world, right? Similar things are happening in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. We have the Young Turk Revolution, and we have the Iranian Revolution, Russian revolutions, Mexican Revolution, all happening right around the same time. So what we're seeing is it is a modern, most definitely a modern conflict. But why do I put it at this point? I think most scholars look at 1917, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when the British and the French break up. They succeed in occupying the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire, and they also occupy, of course, what would become modern Turkey. And we see at that moment, of course, with the issuing of the 1917 Balfour Declaration, that it's going to be a full-fledged conflict. Within 2 or 3 years of World War I, we see a full-fledged conflict.
Can you just tell us what the Balfour Declaration is for our listeners who might not be aware of it?
Yeah, so the Balfour Declaration really is a breaking point in the history where the British promised the Jews, a very, very vaguely wording, a national home in Palestine. And you can go and read about the numerous reasons why they did this. There's still debate about this. A lot of it was sort of this idea, sort of anti-Semitic idea, that Jews actually had power to sway the war this way or that way, right, towards the British. But it really did. It promised the Jews a national home in Palestine, and they were the absolute minority there. And the larger Arab population, which is the Palestinian population, is recognized as the non-Jewish communities, despite that at that point they're about 90% of the population. In 1914, it was about 85%. But during the war, there were major shifts in population, expulsion of part of the Jewish population that brings them to about maybe the Jews maybe were 10-12%. So it's the moment I think the Palestinians for the first time see that they're not going to be represented equally. Now remember, up until 1914, and I'll quickly end here. Up until 1914, you had 3 parliamentarians from the Jerusalem district, and these are, the same families that are going to be prestigious families later on: the El Khalidi family, the El Husseini family, and Nashishibi family. So these are the families that are the traditional families of Arab families of Jerusalem, and they're going to be part of the parliament. So we can sort of argue also that from the fall of the Ottoman Empire all the way up until today, Palestinians in the land itself as Palestine do not have equal representation as they had before 1914. So quickly, let me just position our conversation. 1908, as Djene, as you know, there's the Young Turk Revolution. And the Young Turk Revolution is fascinating that it's a moment in time where Armenians, Greeks, and Jews are given this sort of formula of, yes, you can support the Ottoman state, and you have a new type of Ottomanism, that's sort of across-the-board equality for all the non-Muslim communities. But in return, you're going to have to fight in the army. Fighting in the army and becoming part of the state will allow you some amount of autonomy, right? And that autonomy in Palestine was understood by the Jewish people as a chance to succeed a cultural homeland in Palestine. So it is very, very, very much connected to the 1908 to the 1914 period. And at the same time, Palestinians are starting to say, wait a minute. I mean, Arabs in general are starting to say they're seeing a rise of a Turkish nationalism. There's of course, a rise of Arab nationalism. So each group is, and we can talk more specifically if you want about Palestine itself, but each group is clinging on an idea. So it is a modern conflict. It's a conflict that can be brought easily back into the late 1860s, 1870s. Different laws that were allowing Jews to buy land or preventing them from buying land. And it's the rise of Zionism, which we can talk about.
Speaking of the rise of Zionism, that seems to be a central theme in your work. Today, the term Zionism is often bandied about in political discourse, and depending on one's position on contemporary events, it might hold positive or negative connotations. Could you explain to our listeners what Zionism is and perhaps more precisely what it meant in the early 20th century?
Yeah. So Zionism, basically, I would argue today, is very much like if we look at another earlier 1920s sort of ideology, would that be Kemalism in Turkey? I do a lot of comparison, where there's not a one definitive answer of what it is. So if it really depends on the person who's speaking. So Zionism was emerged in the late 19th century. Theodor Herzl founded this idea, wrote a book called The Jewish State. In a second, we can talk about how it really transitions into something very different than he imagined. Today, Zionism, though, is the idea of Jewish people identifying with the state of Israel, some love, some support of Israel. And it doesn't have to be, I think it's something very natural, yes, there's 20% of Jewish people, or maybe I would imagine less than that are, 15%, 10% are staunchly anti-Zionist. They're often propped up as sort of, the good Jews versus the ones there. Jewish people, I think, around the world, not just America, of course, around the world, have some kind of spiritual, emotional connection. Now, that in itself is I would say, not surprising. And you look at identity politics, even 100 years ago, or even today, Jewish people often are divided, of clinging onto the state they live in, sort of strong patriots of the state, but also having this sort of sense of loyalty to their own people. And I think, that goes for Arab people in the United States. That goes for different groups in the United States. Greeks that have been, decades or even centuries, Greeks that never even lived in mainland Greece, right? They lived maybe in Alexandria and they moved to France, and from France to the US, they'll still have some connection with Greece. Now, for rightly so, for Palestinians, Zionism would be their nightmare, right? That would be their nightmare. It's the idea that the Jews are going to have a homeland in their ancient homeland immediately denies Palestinians existence to some extent, right? Now, that doesn't have to be all of it, and I think that's where we have the extremes that you highlighted, right? Some Jewish people in Israel believe in one state also, but they can still be Zionists. They can still say we want a Jewish political entity here together with Palestinians, right? So that connection with the land is something much more difficult to define, and rightly so. I think Palestinians don't need to hear nuance when you have 30,000 people killed. It's not the time to be explaining what it is, because it's very theoretical, and in practice it is the Israeli state that adopted this ideology of Zionism that gives Jewish people the right to return to the land, right of return, even if they never lived there, and for Palestinians, they do not have the right of return, right? So it is something that's very, very, I would say, even offensive. And I think that's part of the problem we're seeing today. Now, Zionism, the Ottoman Empire, maybe you want to move to that for a second?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, one thing I'm getting from you is that obviously since the formation of the State of Israel in the late 40s, Zionism, basically, we might as well just call it Israeli nation-state nationalism. We have a special word for it, but actually it's a nationalism like other nationalisms. But
it is, but it's not. And I'll tell you why. It is up until 1948. You could argue that Zionism is not Israeli nationalism, but Jewish nationalism. Okay? And I think the problem here, and I'm working on a new work that I'll integrate this into, is that the problem that once there was an Israeli state, Zionism continued, right? And there's no word for Israeli state nationalism other than Zionism for the most part, right? Now, you do hear some people, often older people, that would say, I'm a patriot, ani patrioti in Hebrew, right? It's something you hear less. But most children would say, ani tzioni. The minute you say, I'm a Zionist, that means that you're really for the continuing of the gathering of the exiles to come back and this relations. So it's very different than, in that sense, than I would say Greek nationalism or other nationalisms that you have the right to return, right? You have other nationalisms that, if you can prove your family is from there, you can get citizenship, right? Or that, and I use Greek nationalism because they might have never lived there. But this inability to define the nationalism makes it very difficult. So I hope I was able to clarify that, right? There is something unique about this. And part of the solution is defining what they mean by that, and where do Palestinians fit into this formula, right? Because it's very, very unclear. It's a very, I would say, sort of closed society also, because Jewish people are a very small society to begin with, right? So that those debates that happen within them is something we could talk about, but it is very different for each one. That's saying there's not something defined, right? So you say American nationalism, or you say Israeli nationalism, and I teach it, by the way, exactly what you said. I teach it as Israeli nationalism, right? But when in this context, we're talking about something I think a little bit harder to define, making it more susceptible to these far-reaching claims that all Zionism is racism, right? Which I don't think that would be correct at all.
So, if we go back to the early 20th century, then what did Zionism mean in that context? You mentioned Herzl, who was Austrian and European, but of course there were Jews living in Palestine. There's the continuous Jewish community that has lived in Palestine, and there were also Jews in the Ottoman Empire, in Istanbul, in Baghdad, very important Jewish centers. What did Zionism mean in the early 20th century, in this late Ottoman period? And were there differences between those Jews who were coming to Palestine, Ottoman Palestine, from Russia at first and then later from other parts of Europe, and the Ottoman Jewish community, which, I assume as Ottoman citizens, the Ottoman nationality law is, promulgated in the middle of the 19th century. They can move to Palestine no problem, as far as I understand, as their Ottoman citizens. How is Zionism used in different contexts?
Yeah, so first of all, it's interesting that when you look at Israeli history, much as many nationalist histories have done, is they've completely written out the Ottoman era. And they've actually written in settler colonialism. They've actually written in the narrative of the pioneers coming, building farming communities, and creating a link from the very first time David Ben-Gurion came to the land of Israel or Palestine, all the way up to his prime ministership in 1948, right? So we have a narrative. Djene, if you know Turkish history, it's very much like, pre-Nutuk and after Nutuk, right? You have the sort of the Turkish nationalism that's written in, and it's taken decades, right, to understand what happened before that. So the idea was that there was a Jewish yeshuv. Yeshuv in Hebrew just means a Jewish community in Palestine, Jewish settlement in Palestine. And yes, it was very mixed with, different communities, whether it's Ashkenazi, Sephardic community, which are Jews coming from Spain they were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire in 1492, and they became the largest community. And there was also Arabic speaking community, Arab Jews. So we have Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Arab Jews in Palestine. Now, what we're going to see, and I think this is central to my argument, my later work, or the work I'm working on now more, is that Theodor Herzl had very little to do with what was happening here in Palestine. Theodor Herzl believed that a European power like Britain is going to have to give the Jews a mandate for a country. And he was not, although he comes here in the early 20th century to visit to Palestine, Israel, the land of Israel then, he does not see that the community, he's impressed by that the community, that it's modernizing, and now you have 30 different settlements. In 1881, you have the rise of pogroms in Russia that leads to about 1 million Jews coming to the United States, and about 50, 60,000 coming to Palestine. And the ones that come to Palestine are self-sufficient, the idea that they're going to build these settlements. But we're now seeing that they were a sliver of the population. And the much larger population, Djene, is what you explained, right? Is that, yes, there were Ottoman Jews, and the first settlements were done by Ottoman Sephardic Jews, which could just move from Istanbul, and they came to the land of Israel-Palestine out of reasons of religion. So you had a rabbi from Baghdad arrive here in the mid 19th century. You had a young Jewish Sephardic boy from Djene that arrives to Jerusalem in 1817, and later opens up a shop with a local Palestinian Muslim. And ends up being the president of the Sephardic Jewish community here in Jerusalem. So what we see is that we have a very, very dynamic community that already we're starting to unite, and this is key in my book, right? This is key in my book. They're starting to unite over the issue of Hebrew. By the 1850s and 1860s, you're having modern schools, and Hebrew is back in fashion, you can say. That's in Europe, and that's in Palestine itself. So by 1908, when you have the Young Turk Revolution, you're going to have 6 newspapers here in Palestine. You're going to have 3 Palestinian newspapers. You're going to have 3 Hebrew newspapers. One more of an Ashkenazi revolutionary type, introducing a new Hebrew, which is biblical Hebrew. You're going to have the Sephardic ones, mostly the Arabic-speaking Jews, and what they speak Ladino, right? The Spanish-speaking Jews from Spain that kept Spanish all the way up until today. And you're going to have a more religious-leaning newspaper, but they're all in Hebrew. Meaning by 1911, you have 3 major newspapers in Hebrew. You have 3 major. So I'll just give you the names: Hatzvi, HaChirut, and Moria. And then you have the Palestinian newspaper, which is El-Quds al-Sharif, the Holy Jerusalem newspaper, which is less political. You have Philistine, which is the newspaper Palestine, which is very political, and Al-Carmel in Haifa in the north, which is also very political. So what we're seeing is that even the local Ottoman Jewish community is separating from the Palestinians here. This is different than what's happening in Egypt, where Jewish people are actually saying, we're Zionists, right? And Zionism for them, and Zionism for the people in Palestine, is cultural Zionism. No one can foresee that World War I is going to happen and the empire is going to fall. Not the Arabs and not the Jewish people, Jewish groups. So they're working within this sort of Ottoman system. And that's why I said it had very little to do with what Theodor Herzl wanted. Theodor Herzl, promised 1903, promised a Jewish state in East Africa. He votes for it. He is not, and the majority of the Zionists voted against it. And from 1904, when he dies as pretty young, of a heart attack, and then from 1904, 1905, you have a merging of international Zionism with local Zionism here, and that's really when the conflict starts to take hold. But we see that the Zionist organization already in 1913 starts adopting a very pro-Ottoman stance, saying, you know what, let's work for a cultural homeland here. And that is very, very different than most Zionist narratives. The Israeli narrative is one of pioneers coming. It's a very American. You have the pilgrims versus the Native Americans. Here it would be the pioneers versus the local Palestinian population. But when you look at it, that even with all the issues they're having, Jews and Arabs are living together and they're working together and they are sharing businesses together. So we have to be I think we have to be careful, to look at and that's what my book is bringing in basically, right? It's looking at these Ashkenazi Jews that are saying, let's go fight for the Ottoman army. But it's also looking at Palestinians. And I'll mention this now. It's also looking at Palestinians saying, hold on a second. Jews are getting more and more power here. They're becoming the hegemonic force in Palestine. And if we're not careful, we'll become the minority here. Now, we say, how could they be the minority that they're overwhelming majority? But my work is one of the first works, I think, that have shown that they were worried about Arabs leaving. Okay? Many Jews that came or were here also left to South America and the Americas. So they're worried about this, and they're worried about the infant mortality rates of different things. So it really is, up until 1914, it becomes a conflict of hegemony. And that's why I call it claiming the homeland, right? I call it claiming the homeland because each group is the Jewish group, which is Arab Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, and Sephardic-speaking Jews, are now teaching their kids to only speak Hebrew. And the Palestinians are saying, wait a minute here. Hebrew is getting more and more popular here. What are we going to do with this? And that really is the difference between what's happening in Baghdad, that they're integrating non-Zionists, Egypt, where they're Zionists, and last thing I'll mention in Istanbul. Istanbul, you have the three Palestinian parliamentarians that bring to the parliament floor the issue of Zionism.
That's all we have time for this week. Dr. Fishman, thank you for speaking with us. And thank you, listener, for joining us for Talking History, a presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. Catch us every first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News. Our conversation continues on the podcast, Talking History Extra, available along with our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found.
Okay, welcome back to Talking History, to the Talking History Extra portion of our show. We're having a fantastic conversation with Dr. Louis Fishman about the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in the main show, we discussed the rise of Zionism, the emergence of the Jewish community, the expansion of the Jewish community in Ottoman Palestine in the years leading up to the First World War. And I wanted to change tack here to discuss the impact of the rise of the Zionist movement in Palestine on the Palestinian Arab population, which, often they're portrayed as being a Muslim population, but this also included large numbers of Christians. So what happens in 1908, between 1908 and 1914? You mentioned the Arab parliamentarians. I think it's important for our viewers and listeners to be aware that, in 1908, there is the Young Turk Revolution, and one of the outcomes of that revolution is the reestablishment of an Ottoman parliament, elections for that parliament, and the kind of emergence of parliamentary politics, which is something that you talk about in your book, about the debates in the Ottoman parliament about the question of Zionism, as well as the broader response of, not just Palestinian Arab population, but the Arab population and, of course, the Ottoman Muslim population more generally. So could you talk a little bit about the impact of the rise of the Zionist movement on the Palestinian Arab population, and in what ways and what types of reaction were there to the emergence of the Zionist movement in Palestine?
Yeah, so first of all, I think what we should stress at the outset of this is that, just like the Jewish community was modernizing during this period, the Palestinians were modernizing, and they're part of the larger Arab community in Palestine. When we talk about Palestinians during this period, it's really the beginning of what we call I call local patriotism. Palestinians supporting this idea of Philistine or defending the land of Philistine from either Zionism or from a British onslaught, right? Where they really feared, at this moment that, Palestine could be lost to the British. We already had, from the early 1880s, the Britain is now in full control of Egypt. We have India right there around the corner. And it's very funny that we talk about, the corridor right now from Saudi Arabia to through Israel, right? This was the talk of the town before October 7th, right? The first time this comes up is in Ottoman documents. They're saying the British are going to try to create a railroad from Saudi Arabia, from India, excuse me, through Arabistan, through the Arab lands, up through Palestine. So the Palestinians, yes, they're part of a greater, renaissance in Arab language, Arab culture, and that's very unique that brings Christians and Muslims together, right? And the Christian population today is rather small, but then it was at least 20% of the population throughout the Arab world, right? Arab nationalism in many ways is quite unique to what's happening in other places where Russia has a Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. You have to have it's between Greek nationalism and Greek Orthodox. There's a fine line that connects them together, right? Where Arab nationalism from the very first days are Muslims and Christians, and sometimes Jews also. Okay, so I think that the Palestinian people are in this moment where they're in a renaissance. For whatever reason, the Jerusalem, and I think this is important, Jerusalem to me is almost like a neighborhood of Istanbul. It's much more connected to Istanbul than, let's say, I would say Damascus or even Baghdad to a great extent. And they see themselves as supporters of the main party, the Committee of Union and Progress, which was behind the Young Turk Revolution. Now, this puts the Palestinians in sort of a hard position because at the same moments you have a rise in anti-Zionism, which is actually anti-Semitic in this sense. I know there's a huge debate today where they're saying Jews are behind the overthrow of the empire. And I've developed this up in a new article that should be published soon. So it's also in the book. So Palestinians are on one hand, when they're debating this in the parliament, they're debating against their own government, that they're part of it, if you follow me on that. So they had a challenge. Now, what was the challenge of the Palestinians, and what makes Palestinians Palestinians in this era? Because already by the late 19th century, early 20th century, you start seeing a proliferation in the word Philistine. Now, Philistine, from Islamic times all the way forward, we know the term Philistine. It's used to describe the Holy Land, and it's only I would say in the modern era that the local population starts to describe themselves as Philistinian or Shaba Falastini, the Palestinian people. Now, this is important. I can't stress this more for the podcast. Is that there is a campaign, and there has been a campaign for decades to deny the Palestinians their own existence, as if there was no such things ever as Palestinians until the Palestinian Liberation Organization emerged in the 60s. So it's very important in my book to point out that, what makes them Palestinian is there's a multitude of reasons. One, it's the unity of Christians and Muslims. Christians writing off in the newspapers, Muslims also writing in the newspapers, but also politicians. They were more the politicians. So we have a uniting together between Christian and Muslims to defend the homeland against this fear of growing Jewish hegemony, and also a feared British onslaught. On the other hand, you have peasants that are starting to write petitions to Istanbul and say, we're losing our land. Jewish people were buying more and more land. Now, this is, Djene would know this, Patrick, perhaps you don't know, But there's sort of this pride in Turkey that the Sultan Abdulhamid II refused to sell an inch of land to Palestine. But maybe he was against, in theory, Jewish immigration. He was never able to stop it. And there were Ottoman laws that were eased in the early 1900s to allow Jews to get residency or citizenship in the Ottoman lands. So it's actually under Abdulhamid II where the Jewish community gets a stronger hold. And the Young Turk Revolution, who they're accused of having Zionists behind them, nothing really budges during the Young Turk period. And that's something that we understand it differently, opposite, in fact. So the Palestinians see that there is if the peasants are going to be removed to the land after Jews purchase the land, then the middlemen, who are the muhtars, the village leaders, they're not going to have a place to go either, right? So what we see is the whole breakdown of the system. So what we're seeing in the late Ottoman period is what we're going to see over and over again: a landless peasant class. That landless peasant class that it explodes in 1930s, and you have the 1936 revolt eventually, right? So a lot of things we can trace back to the Ottoman period to say, you know what, this is the case. Now in 1917 and 1918, there is a Arab kingdom that's formed in Syria under Faisal, who sided with the British. And at this point, Palestine very briefly becomes what they call southern Syria. So in our minds is that southern Syria was always southern Syria, Palestine. And I say no. It's very clear arguments laid out in my book how this was for the people that lived in Palestine. It was Philistine. And most importantly, and I'll end here, is they also saw them as the protectorates of the holy sites. I don't stress enough in my book how Jerusalem is a holy city. It's holy for Muslims, it's holy for Jews. But the Palestinian Muslims and Christians saw themselves also as protecting the Holy Land, which is the holy city of Jerusalem. The Jewish community, even if they were the majority, was a very divided community. And I don't think they had this fear of the need to protect it, right? And that's because of archaeological digs. And I bring a whole chapter in about the Captain Parker's dig and how we see the reactions of Palestinians as Palestinians for the first time over an issue that has nothing to do with Zionism. And I think that's what our challenge is. Because to understand Palestinians, we have to stop looking at them through the lens of the Jewish minority, of the conflict. Rather, we have to look at them as the majority, and we have to find out what made them Palestinian, or what were their interests, what were their worries, what were their motivations. And there's still a lot of work to do on that. There's no doubt in the press, there's a lot of work to be done, because Zionism was just one issue. It was not the main issue. There were many issues during that period that they were preoccupied with.
Yeah, and I think the point that you raise about the land question and the emergence of landless peasants, again speaks to the modernity of the problem. This problem emerges with the land code in the Ottoman Empire and the way that land code was implemented in some parts of the empire. Farmers were able to register the land, but especially in places like Palestine, a lot of the land of that villages may have worked for generations was registered in the names of absentee landlords, some of whom lived in Damascus and other major metropoles, and they were selling
mostly Beirut, actually. Mostly Beirut.
And they were selling that land. The question, of course, is who is selling the land to the Jewish community? Well, it was often Muslim and Christian landlords.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's at this moment where I think the Arab press sees that they have a responsibility for these peasants. I mean, if we think about it, without peasants, who are the majority of the population, or a very large part of the population, right? Then how are you going to have a people? So they're not thinking, how to create a people, although we'll see that many nationalists are actually preoccupied with that question. How do we construct, a nation. And this is not unique to Zionism, for example. Zionism, in the sense, is sort of classical, is that you have people trying to construct a certain vision of a nation, which is very, very rigid and leads to political impasses. What we see in Israel today, what we see among Palestinians to a great extent, by the way. Palestinians, I would say later on, have that pushing out the level of the notables. So the notables are the ones that are in control, even up through the 1960s, right? And then find the Palestinian Liberation Organization really pushes them aside. So we look at the impasse in the Arab countries. If we look at everything in the greater picture, and this is the work I'm working on now, is the post-World War I era. It's Zionism or the Palestine question is not unique in the sense that every country that was formed, after the Sykes-Picot was, they divided the lands, is a failure to a great extent. And that, will lead to the Syrian war in 2011 up to 2015, 16, right? Hundreds of thousands of people killed. That leads to the imbalance of power in Lebanon, right? And that leads to Palestinians being pushed out in the post-1917 Balfour Declaration, and later in 1947. Yes, they're offered some kind of state, but it's not. They were the majority, and it would be hard to imagine anyone would accept it under those circumstances. So what we're dealing with is these very long-term issues that in a post-Ottoman world, it's really hard to understand, how these local patriotisms turn into mainstream nationalisms, but they're still not reconciled. The Palestinians are not reconciled as, yes, they're one people, but they have these internal issues that I think, are not unique just to them, but you have to look over, it's unique to them that they don't have a state, that's for sure. But the countries did get states, I call the successful failures of these states. Iraq, for example, it's over who controls the state, right? And there's constant battles, internal maneuvering, right, to conjure up majorities. And then that's Israel too, also, that by far, very sectarian states that they're at a political impasse. I would say most countries in the region. So that's that. I brought it a different direction now, but I think that what we're seeing here is something much more deeper that we're not recognizing it, right? Much more profound than just yes, it's on one hand it will turn into a very settler colonialistic type of system, but the roots of it I think are quite different than other settler colonial states.
You've mentioned the fall of the Ottoman Empire a couple of times, and your book concludes with the outbreak of the First World War. So how did the First World War transform the competition between the Jewish and non-Jewish communities in Palestine?
I mean, the outcome is clear, and I'm working on. I'll play around with giving you the answer I'm developing. Is post World War I Ottoman lands, people came to the sad conclusion that different ethnic and religious groups, not only can they not live together anymore, but it's not natural that they live together. I hope you got that, right? That, it's not that it's just impossible. We have to fix this imperfection. And that's going to lead to the mass killing of Armenians, which is the Armenian genocide. That's going to lead to the Greek-Turkish exchange. And in Palestine, that's going to lead to a new British order that's going to promise the Jews a homeland, whatever that means, a national homeland. During that little window of time, you have parts of the Jewish population are expelled because they're not Ottoman citizens. You still have many Ashkenazi, even Ottoman Jews, fighting, immigrants born in Palestine to parents that came from Russia, fighting for the Ottoman Empire. And the second prime minister of Israel, Moshe Sharett, fights with the Ottomans until 7 months after the or 10 months after the Balfour Declaration is issued. So think about that. The second prime minister of Israel, Moshe Sharett, who grew up in Palestine, born in Eastern Europe, grows up in Palestine as a young boy, is fluent in Arabic, right? Grows up actually in if I remember right, the Arab neighborhood or school even, and ends up in Istanbul with Ben Gurion and all these other people studying law in Istanbul. So if you think about it, it's interesting that the first leaders of the Arab states and Ben Gurion and all them knew each other in Istanbul. So in the post-World War I era, is the idea is that people cannot live together anymore, and that's going to lead also to the partial expulsion of the Jewish community. But this is what I'm working on: is that the Jewish community was very worried that their fate would be that of the Armenians, right? The fact that Israel doesn't recognize the Armenian genocide today is ironic for numerous reasons, and we won't go into that right now, but I've written about that also quite a bit. But the idea was that they also feared that their time was limited here, and when the British give them a promise, that's a major game changer. And I really think that puts the Jewish community that was colonialistic at the core to accept something like this, right? To accept something this. But even after the Balfour Declaration, you have the Faisal-Weizmann Accords. Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader, and King Faisal, who ends up being thrown out of Syria and goes to Iraq, and his brothers Abdullah and Jordan, right? He proposed this idea, it's one of the missed opportunities of a Jewish autonomous homeland within an Arab kingdom, right? So even in 1920, 1918, 19, you still have moments where, yes, there could be a possibility of having some kind of Jewish autonomous homeland within Palestine.
So
post 1920, this ends.
So
and from there on, there's this idea of separation only, and that separation only is what leads us to these political impasses.
So prior to the First World War, there are both sort of centrifugal and centripetal forces, both bringing people together and separating people from one another. There are both those tendencies, but the First World War kind of resolves that in the kind of separatist direction ultimately. So before the First World War, there were perhaps different paths that could have been tread on this way. But after the First World War, we see kind of a path dependency emerging in which is shaped by this idea that different communities just can't live together, which, if we look historically, was not the case. As people may have had conflicts, but there were mechanisms by which people did live side by side.
Yes, and that's gonna be a process that only really is in full fruition into the 1930s and the 36 revolt, right? Up into the 20s and 30s, you still have joint Jewish-Arab enterprises here in Palestine, right? You have plenty of people that believe, yes, that they can live together. You have on one hand, you have the Brit Shalom, which is sort of this idea of both nations living here in the same land with some kind of both having equality. You have a vibrant communist party that's small, but that lasts over, it's the same communist party. The oldest party in the Israeli Knesset goes back to 1919, that's the Communist Party, right? So that process is going to be very painful, I would say, and it's going to lead to separation. That's really that's where we're at. And just because of your own work, Djene, I'll mention that I recently tweeted something like this, but the two peoples that did not get a homeland think about this, in the post-World War I era are Kurds and Palestinians, right? And, that is pretty telling when you put it like that, right? Is that if you're going to divide up the lands and give every group something, right, and you leave two groups out, of course, Kurds being divided by 4 different countries, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. And we see the two peoples to this day are in a struggle for recognition, political recognition, whatever that is, right? It's very hard to define, but I would say, political recognition as being Kurds or as being Palestinian, right? So I think that, yes, of course, they're very different, but they're very similar in the idea that they were ignored. They were ignored, right? Over time. And I think that's telling that this when we think about people can't live together, anyone that does Ottoman history, yeah, of course, it's not like everything was great and everyone got along, but there was, and I don't want to start sounding, like I'm longing for the Ottoman days, because anyone knows how I write history. I'm not soft in any period, I don't think. But there was something very central to the Ottoman identity, that you're going to have Jews, Christians, and Muslims in every city, right? And that's from the Balkans all the way up through the Holy Land, right? Syria, Beirut, Cairo, even, when you get what I'm saying here. So yeah, and that is going to be something that's put in the past, giving a sort of a catalyst to what Zionists want also, right? Zionists are following this very closely, in my opinion. And so, in that sense, there's all these inequalities that are emerging during this period. Lebanon, there's no sense of equality in Lebanon, period. This idea that there was a Christian majority, we see is also in something fabricated. To a great extent. I teach an article about this. Anyone can write me anything, and I can send an article. But right, so we're seeing here, and it's not by mistake that in 1948, over 50% of the Turkish Jews pick up and come to Palestine. They're not forced out, right? It's not like the Iraqi Jews that are forced out, or Yemenite Jews, right? I think all the Jews in the Aegean region, within 2 years, pack up and leave almost. Aydin, Bergama, Akhisar, all these other places, they're leaving, right? Because they already saw that there's not really room for them anymore. And I'll end the sentence by saying that the sense of mobility for these people, for the Arab Jews, for the Arab Palestinians, for Palestinians, for Syrians, for people, Turkish people, there wasn't this idea of borders, and suddenly you have rigid borders, and that's going to play a heavy toll in all these populations. So unfortunately, I think that this was what was understood from World War I, was that with the rise of Turkish nationalism also, that there's going to be very little room for what once was the norm.
Well, Dr. Fishman, thank you so much for sticking around for Talking History Extra. This was a fantastic conversation. I think our listeners are really going to appreciate it, especially because it's a highly topical, subject to be approaching. And I think the historian's eye that you do so well on this issue really gives us an important perspective that is often missing in the kind of general discourse.
Well, thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see better days.
Inshallah.
Our guest again was Dr. Louis Fishman, and his book is Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Era, 1908 to 1914, Claiming Homeland. Thank you for joining us for Talking History Extra.